Locked doors, whispers in the night, and shadows that never leave. Can anyone survive the house that never sleeps? The family stood in front of their new home, a place that seemed to promise everything they had been looking for. Modern amenities, spacious rooms, and a price that felt too good to be true. The house was nestled on a quiet street, the kind of place that seemed perfect for a fresh start. But as they walked through the front door, something felt off. The air was thick, heavy, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for them to settle in. They pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to excitement. The realtor, a sharply dressed man with a too-perfect smile, had already begun giving them a tour. "Lovely, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "You'll love the quiet. The house has a history, of course, but nothing that should concern you." They walked through the house, admiring the high ceilings and polished floors. Everything looked pristine, like no one had ever lived there. But something lingered in the corners, in the shadows. The father, Mark, couldn't help but notice something strange. There were no locks on any of the doors, not a single one. "Is this normal?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty as he examined the doorknobs. The realtor chuckled. "Ah yes, part of the charm. This house has never needed locks. You'll see, there's no reason for them." He spoke with a confidence that didn't sit right with Mark. Mark glanced at his wife, Emily, who seemed equally puzzled, but they shrugged it off. After all, the house was perfect, too perfect to pass up. As they continued the tour, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them. It was subtle, like an invisible presence, but it was there. He glanced at the windows, large, open panes that let in the afternoon sunlight, and noticed there were no locks there either. "Do the windows always stay open like this?" Emily asked. "It feels a little strange." "Not a problem," the realtor assured them. "The house has its own ventilation system. You'll get used to the breeze." But Mark wasn't convinced. The windows were wide open, yet the air inside felt stagnant, almost suffocating. As they made their way to the basement, the sense of unease grew stronger. The house creaked underfoot, but not in the usual way. It was more like a deep, rhythmic groan, like the house was alive, stretching its limbs after a long, dormant sleep. "Everything's fine," the realtor insisted, though his voice faltered for just a moment. "You'll get used to the sounds. Old houses can be a little temperamental." But something in his eyes told Mark that there was more to the house than met the eye. Later that evening, as they unpacked, Emily's unease continued to grow. The house felt too quiet, too still. Even the sound of their footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the thick silence. The absence of locks on the doors and windows began to gnaw at her. She looked at Mark. What if we're not supposed to be here?" she whispered, though she quickly dismissed the thought. "No, it's just nerves. Everything's fine." But as the darkness crept in and the house began to settle for the night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the walls that were watching them. It was the house itself. The first night in the house was supposed to be peaceful. After the long day of moving in, the family retired to their rooms, eager to rest. But the quiet of the house felt strange, unnerving. It was almost too still. Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence pressed on him, suffocating him. He glanced at Emily, who slept soundly beside him, unaware of the unease creeping through the room. Then it started. A faint whisper, soft, almost inaudible, sliced through the air. Mark froze. It wasn't his imagination. The voice it was calling him, barely a sound, but there, unmistakable. He turned to Emily. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She didn't stir. The house was old. It creaked. Maybe it was just the wind. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, closer. The voice wasn't alone anymore. Footsteps echoed through the hall. Light, shuffling steps, too light, too deliberate. Mark sat up, his heart pounding. "Emily," he whispered, shaking her gently, but she didn't wake. The footsteps continued, now from the hallway, moving closer. Mark slowly got out of bed. His feet touched the cold wooden floor, the boards creaking under his weight. He opened the door, peering into the darkness of the hallway. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices, but still too faint to understand. And the footsteps, they moved, as if they were searching for something, someone. His breath hitched. There was no one there. Mark stepped into the hallway, his skin prickling with cold. The footsteps continued, echoing from every corner of the house. Not just one set of footsteps. There were many, all moving in different directions. A cold breeze swept past him, chilling him to the bone. The whispers surged, now unmistakable. "Get out." He turned, heart racing. The hallway stretched on, too long, too dark. The voices seemed to follow him, circling, closing in. Mark slammed the door shut behind him, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were outside the room now, echoing louder, like something was waiting just outside. Emily stirred in her sleep, mumbling his name. Mark could barely find his voice. "Emily, wake up," he whispered frantically. But the whispers grew louder still, relentless, and the footsteps never ceased. The house was alive with them, trapped in an endless loop. And Mark had a feeling the night was only just beginning. Days passed in the house, but the unsettling feeling never faded. At first, the family dismissed the strange events as coincidence. An old house, after all, creaks and groans. But things were getting worse. It started with small things, items that weren't where they were left. A picture frame turned slightly askew. Then, one evening, the door to the living room slammed shut on its own with a force that rattled the windows. Emily rushed to the door, thinking it was a draft, but there was no breeze, no explanation. The next day, Mark placed his keys on the kitchen counter before heading out. When he returned, they were gone. The keys were nowhere to be found, as though they had vanished into thin air. He checked the entire house, retracing his steps, but nothing. No trace of them. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger by the day. One night, the youngest child, Lily, came running into their bedroom, wide-eyed with terror. "Mom, Dad," she cried. "There's someone in the hallway. I saw them. Shadows moving." Mark and Emily exchanged a glance. Lily was scared easily, they thought, but the tone in her voice was unlike anything they'd ever heard. They dismissed it as a nightmare, but deep down, they both felt a rising unease. The next night, the same thing happened again. Lily refused to go to bed, her wide eyes darting nervously at the corners of the room. "They're watching me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw them again." At first, Emily tried to comfort her, thinking it was just a child's imagination. But when the lights flickered above them, casting long, unnatural shadows across the room, Emily's heart skipped a beat. Mark set out to check the house again, just to reassure Lily. But as he passed the hallway, he felt something cold brush against his neck. He turned quickly. Nothing. No one was there. But the shadows seemed darker, thicker, as though they were alive. In the kitchen, a glass of water that had been sitting untouched on the counter suddenly tipped over, spilling across the floor. Mark froze. The room was eerily still, but it felt like the walls were closing in. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of whispering filled the air again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a haunting murmur that seemed to come from every corner of the house. The walls vibrated, pulsing with the sounds. The whispers spoke of death, of warnings long ignored. And then, just as quickly, everything went silent. The house was still, but Mark knew something was watching. Something was waiting. Lily, trembling in her bed, looked up at him, her face pale. "They're still here," she whispered. "They never leave." In the days that followed, the house became more oppressive, its grip tightening around the family. The whispers were constant now, filling the silence, seeping into their thoughts. No one felt safe. Even Lily, who had once been so brave, now trembled at every shadow, every flicker of light. Desperate for answers, Mark and Emily began searching the house, hoping to find something that could explain the madness consuming them. They scoured the attic, pushing aside old boxes and forgotten relics from the house's past. That's when they found it, a dusty, leather-bound journal hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. Mark opened it cautiously, the pages yellowed with age. As he flipped through the journal, a cold chill crept up his spine. The entries were fragmented, written in hurried, almost frantic script. The journal belonged to a woman who had lived in the house decades ago. She had chronicled her experiences, and they were chilling. It didn't take long for them to discover the truth. The house, this seemingly perfect modern home, was not just old. It was alive, and it was hungry. The journal spoke of a malevolent force that had inhabited the house for generations, feeding off the fear and despair of its residents. "It never lets you leave," one of the entries read. "It traps you here, makes you believe you can escape, but in the end, you're its prisoner. Forever." Mark's hands shook as he read the words aloud. People vanish. They don't just leave. They disappear. No one ever finds them again. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she processed the words. That's why the realtor said there were no locks, because no one can escape. The realization hit them like a punch. They weren't just dealing with a haunted house. They were trapped in it, bound by something darker, older, and far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Lily, still trembling in the corner, spoke up in a voice barely above a whisper. "I told you," she said, "it never lets you go. It never stops watching." A loud crash echoed from downstairs. The house seemed to respond to their discovery, the walls groaning, the air thick with a heavy, suffocating presence. The family knew that now, the stakes had changed. They weren't just trying to survive. They had to find a way out before the house claimed them like so many others before. The journal had given them the truth, but it didn't offer them hope. They were running out of time. A cold wind blew through the desolate streets as the group of paranormal investigators pulled up to the infamous mansion. Hidden away in the woods, far from the nearest town, the house had stood abandoned for decades, its crumbling exterior a silent witness to the horrors of the past. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the place, warning others to stay away. They claimed to hear screams echoing from the windows, shadowy figures moving behind the glass, and whispers carried on the wind. The team, led by the experienced investigator, David, wasn't one to give in to superstition. They had investigated countless haunted locations, but something about the mansion's eerie silence unsettled them. Tonight, they would prove the stories wrong, or so they thought. "We're here to document the truth, not let rumors dictate our findings," David said, as they gathered their gear. The rest of the team nodded, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Cameras, EVP recorders, and thermal sensors were set up, each member prepared for a long night ahead. As they stepped inside, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. The musty scent of decay hung thick in the hallway, and the wooden floorboards groaned beneath their feet. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the faint light from their flashlights. The house seemed frozen in time, its rooms untouched by the outside world. But there was an undeniable sense of something watching them, lurking just beyond the reach of a light. They moved through the house, investigating room by room, recording everything they could. It didn't take long before the first signs of activity began. A flickering light overhead caught their attention. David looked up, his brow furrowing. "That wasn't in the plan," he muttered. But there was no time for concern. They were here to gather evidence. The temperature dropped sharply as they moved into the main hallway. Their breath became visible in the cold air. They paused for a moment, listening. Faintly, in the distance, they could hear something. Voices, muffled and distant, like whispers carried through thick walls. The sound seemed to surround them, echoing in every direction. It was coming from everywhere. As they ventured deeper into the house, the group started feeling the weight of the place. The walls seemed to close in on them. The oppressive atmosphere made it hard to breathe. And then they saw it, a figure, fleeting and transparent, standing in the doorway of the room at the end of the hall. For a brief moment, it was there, a shadowy outline that seemed to shimmer in the dark. "Did you see that?" Sarah, one of the investigators, whispered, her voice shaking. She hadn't expected to be afraid. David's voice was tight with tension. "Stay focused. Let's get the evidence. We'll go through it all later." But deep down, they all knew something wasn't right. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was alive, and it was watching them. The group continued their investigation, setting up equipment in the dimly lit parlor. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the house's decaying structure. David adjusted the camera in the corner, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Something about the place unsettled him, but he dismissed it. They had a job to do. Suddenly, Sarah froze, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to her, puzzled. "I didn't hear anything," David replied, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" Sarah's eyes darted around nervously. "It sounded like someone whispered my name. Clear as day." The group fell silent. The house was old, yes, and the wind outside had been howling, but that wasn't what had unsettled her. Sarah was sure she'd heard something, a voice, soft but unmistakable, calling her name. "We're all hearing things." Mark, the skeptic of the group, laughed nervously. "It's just your imagination. This place messes with your head." They all nodded, trying to push the discomfort aside, chalking it up to the house's eerie atmosphere. They continued setting up cameras in the adjacent room, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the hall behind them. But it wasn't just Sarah now who felt a strange presence. As they worked, others began to see things, shadows darting just beyond their peripheral vision, figures that disappeared when they turned to look. The temperature dropped in spots, an unnatural cold that settled in the air, chilling their skin. At first, they all brushed it off. It was all part of the thrill of investigating a place with such a dark history. But then it happened. Mark, who had been in the kitchen setting up an EVP recorder, suddenly screamed. The rest of the team rushed to his side. He was standing frozen, staring at the doorway to the kitchen, his face ashen. "There was someone standing there," he said, his voice trembling. "A figure. I saw it clear as day. It looked right at me." Before they could respond, a sharp, sudden noise echoed from upstairs. A loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps running down the hall. The group scrambled, grabbing flashlights and racing toward the sound. But when they reached the staircase, they stopped in horror. One of their team members, Liz, was gone. No sign of her, no scream, just an empty spot where she had been standing only moments before. A wave of panic surged through the group. They couldn't explain what had just happened. "We need to find her," David said, his voice low and urgent. This isn't a game anymore." But deep inside, they all knew. The house had claimed its first victim. As the night deepened, the team's nerves were on edge. The house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its halls now feeling like a maze, twisting and suffocating. They hadn't found Liz, no trace of her at all, but they couldn't afford to waste time. The eerie presence pressing against them grew stronger by the minute. "We need to find answers," David said, trying to steady his breath. The house was closing in, its silence deafening. The group made their way into the study, an old room filled with dusty furniture, shelves lined with forgotten books, and what looked like personal items left behind. In the far corner of the room, a large, ornate desk stood against the wall, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and old photographs. Mark picked up one of the photos, his hand trembling. It was a black and white image of a man in a long coat, standing proudly in front of the mansion. The man's face was sharp, cold, and unsettling, as if he knew something no one else did. Behind him, the house loomed, a dark, brooding presence. But something in the background caught Mark's eye. The faintest outline of a shadowed figure stood in the window, almost blending into the house's frame. "Look at this," he said, showing the photo to the others. "There's something off about this." They all leaned in. As they studied the photo, Sarah found something else, an old, leather-bound diary tucked under a pile of papers. Its pages were thick with age, the ink faded but still legible. David flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning quickly. The entries grew more erratic, speaking of rituals, of binding spirits to the house. The man in the photo, Ezekiel Holloway, had been the mansion's first owner, but it wasn't just wealth he sought. He had dabbled in dark magic, conducting sinister rituals in the deepest parts of the house. The journal spoke of summoning spirits, of trapping their souls within the walls, forcing them to remain as slaves to the mansion. And as the last soul enters the house, David read aloud, his voice trembling, "They will never escape. Their whispers will echo forever in these halls, their agony a part of this place. The house will feed on them." The others stood frozen, their minds racing. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, fed by the spirits of those trapped within it. Those who died here didn't leave. They were bound to the mansion, forced to roam the halls for eternity, seeking release from their torment. Sarah shuddered. Those spirits are still here, and they're angry. David's eyes darkened. "We're not just dealing with ghosts. We're dealing with souls who are screaming for freedom. But would they be able to escape before they became part of the house's twisted collection?" The mansion seemed to come alive, its walls closing in, creaking and groaning like a living creature. The air was thick with the weight of unseen eyes, the oppressive presence of the trapped souls surrounding the group. Every step they took was met with cold drafts and whispers, faint but growing louder. "We need to leave," Sarah urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to get out of here." But David's face was grim, his eyes scanning the shadows. The spirits were no longer just an eerie presence. They were angry, violent. The air hummed with the power of their wrath. "Liz is still out there. We can't leave her," he said, his voice trembling with both fear and determination. "We can't let them take her." Mark and Sarah exchanged a look. They had seen too much, felt too much. The house was now fully awake, its malignant energy pushing them to the brink of insanity. The spirits, bound by Ezekiel Holloway's dark rituals, were growing restless. Their tormented cries echoed through the house like a chorus of despair. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from upstairs, like the sound of furniture crashing. David didn't hesitate. "It's her," he shouted, racing toward the stairs. Sarah and Mark hesitated, but they followed him, the oppressive presence of the house pressing down on them. Upstairs, the corridor was darker than it had been before, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, as if reaching for them. They reached Liz's room, but the door was slammed shut, locked from the inside. "Liz, are you in there?" David yelled, pounding on the door. A faint whisper answered, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was Liz's voice, strained and distant. "Help me. They won't let me go." A cold gust of air swept through the hallway, extinguishing their flashlights. Panic surged through the group, but they knew what they had to do. The spirits weren't just trying to trap Liz. They wanted them all. Mark turned to David. We can't wait. We need to fight back. The spirits are feeding off our fear. David nodded grimly, pulling a piece of the journal from his backpack. They had to break the curse, but it wasn't going to be easy. The ritual to free the spirits required a sacrifice, a willingness to face the entity head on and risk everything. We do this together, David said. We stand our ground. With the door still locked, the spirits howled louder, their voices mingling with the wind that howled outside. The floor beneath their feet trembled, the walls seeming to close in. The house was not just haunted, it was alive, hungry, and it would not let them go without a fight. As the spirits grew more violent, the investigators realized there was only one choice left. They had to confront the malevolent force, face the terror that had trapped Liz and the others, and hope that they could save themselves before the mansion claimed them too. Lena had always felt an uneasy pull toward the old mansion her aunt had left her. It stood on a quiet street, isolated from the hustle of the city, its tall, Gothic windows like hollow eyes staring out into the night. She never knew her aunt well, but the inheritance seemed like an opportunity, an escape from her hectic life. The house was massive, its rooms filled with dust and secrets. Lena's first few days there were spent sorting through old furniture, old memories. As she ventured deeper into the mansion, the more she noticed things that didn't quite make sense. Rooms that seemed to stretch further than they should, a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. One afternoon, while exploring the basement, she stumbled upon something that didn't belong. A door, a thick wooden door, set in the farthest corner, hidden behind stacks of old furniture. It was strange. No one had ever mentioned it, not the realtor, not even the neighbors. The door didn't appear on any of the house's floor plans. Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine as she stared at it, an inexplicable feeling gnawing at her gut. She approached the door cautiously, her hand hovering over the brass handle. It felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. The house creaked around her, as if it were watching her, waiting. But curiosity won over caution, and with a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow, dark hallway beyond. The air smelled musty, stale, and thick with dust. The hallway was almost impossibly long, stretching deeper into the earth than the basement should allow. Lena's heart raced as she stepped forward, her footfalls echoing ominously in the silence. The walls seemed to close in on her as she walked further down the hallway. The space felt unnatural, as though it didn't belong to the house at all. The floor was uneven beneath her, each step reverberating with a hollow sound. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting at the end of the hall. But before she could take another step, the air shifted. A faint whisper, almost a breath, but too soft to be her own, brushed against her ear. Lena spun around, but no one was there. The door she had just come through slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her in the hallway. Panic surged through her as she struggled with the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she realized she was not alone. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the narrow hallway, the door now firmly shut behind her. The air in the basement had turned colder, the silence suffocating. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to go back upstairs and forget about this place. But her curiosity burned too bright, pushing her forward. She had to know what lay beyond that door. With trembling hands, Lena turned back to face the wooden door. It was impossible to ignore now. The mysterious room, the eerie sensation that something inside was calling to her. She took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage, and slowly turned the handle once more. The door creaked open with an unnerving sound, like it had not been disturbed in years. The dim light from the basement barely illuminated what lay beyond, but enough to reveal something wrong. Inside was a small, decaying room, hidden deep within the walls of the mansion. The air smelled of rot, dampness, and something else, something metallic. The walls were covered with strange, swirling symbols, etched deeply into the wood, some still faintly glowing with an unnatural, sickly hue. The pattern seemed to pulse, as though alive, as if they were watching her. Lena's breath caught in her throat. What had her aunt been hiding here? What had this room been used for? The center of the room was dominated by a single, worn chair. It was old, its wood cracked and splintered, as though it had been abandoned for decades. But it wasn't the chair itself that unsettled her. It was the heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to hang in the air. The room felt alive. Every corner seemed to pulse with the weight of something ancient, something wrong. She stepped further into the room, her feet scraping against the rough, uneven floorboards. Her eyes flicked back to the walls, studying the symbols in greater detail. They weren't just random shapes. No, they seemed deliberate, each one linked to the other, creating a pattern that hinted at something dark, something sinister. Lena reached out, her fingers brushing against the nearest symbol. As soon as her skin made contact, a jolt of icy energy shot through her body. She gasped, her vision blurring, and the air around her seemed to thicken. The room felt colder, darker. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching toward her as if they were alive. Her heart raced, and for a moment, she wondered if she should leave, if she should run. But it was too late. A low, whispering voice echoed through the room, reverberating in her ears. Lena turned, but no one was there. The voice was distant, muffled, but unmistakably clear. Leave before it's too late. The air in the house had changed since Lena opened the forbidden room. At first, it was subtle, flickering lights, odd drafts, a chill that lingered in the corners. But soon, the disturbances escalated. One morning, Lena walked into the kitchen to find the cupboard doors wide open, their contents scattered across the floor. She thought she'd left them neatly arranged the night before. As she bent to pick up the fallen dishes, her eyes caught something even more unnerving. The kitchen knife, which had been placed neatly on the counter, was now lying on the floor, inches from her foot. Shaking her head, she tried to dismiss it as exhaustion. She'd been working late on the renovations, and the house was old. Creaks and groans were to be expected. But that night, as she settled into bed, the whispering began. Soft at first, like a far-off murmur, the voices seemed to drift through the walls. They called her name, slow and deliberate, almost as if beckoning her. She gripped the covers tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were too clear, too real to ignore. Lena, come closer. She shot up from her bed, her breathing shallow, every muscle in her body tense. Her eyes scanned the room, searching the dark corners, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence that followed the whispers like a thick fog. Days later, Lena decided to visit a local historian in town, hoping to uncover more about her aunt's strange house and the room she had discovered. The historian, an elderly man with graying hair and tired eyes, didn't hesitate when she mentioned the locked door in the basement. That room, he paused, looking around as though he feared being overheard. It wasn't meant to be opened. Lena listened closely as the historian told her the history of the mansion and the room she had uncovered. The house was built atop an old burial ground, and the room had been sealed off centuries ago. According to local lore, the space had been used to trap a malevolent entity, a force of pure evil that had once terrorized the area. The man who built the mansion had attempted to contain the spirit, locking it away in the basement room, using ancient rituals to ensure it could never escape. The historian's voice dropped to a whisper. Whatever you do, Lena, do not go near that room again. It wants to be free. Lena could feel it now, its presence. cold, oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in around her. The whispers had turned into growls, low and guttural, echoing through the house. They were no longer just in the walls. They were inside her mind. Lena, the voice hissed her name, each syllable laced with malice. You can't escape me. At first, she thought it was just the stress, the exhaustion from days of relentless work and the haunting mysteries of the house. But now it was real. The room was trying to claim her, using the very house to warp her thoughts, to twist her reality. It was as if the entity knew her every fear and vulnerability, pushing them all to the surface. Lena had tried to sleep, tried to ignore the creeping dread that followed her every step, but the nightmares wouldn't let her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The decaying room, the ancient symbols on the walls, the chair at the center, stained with something she couldn't place. The entity, it was stronger now, angrier, and it was growing more powerful by the hour. One night, as Lena paced through the dimly lit halls, she felt an overwhelming coldness. The temperature had dropped so suddenly it took her breath away. She reached out, trying to steady herself against the wall, and it was then that she saw it, a shadow in the corner of the hallway. It wasn't just any shadow. It had shape, form. It was awaiting. In a flash of panic, Lena ran to the basement, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The door to the cursed room stood before her, menacing and untouched, as if daring her to enter once more. But she couldn't. She knew now what she had to do, what her aunt had failed to do. She rushed to the old journals, flipping through the pages frantically, searching for any clue. There, buried in the last few pages, she found the ritual. The instructions were vague, but it was her only hope. Reseal the room before the entity grew strong enough to break free. With trembling hands, Lena gathered the materials she needed, candles, salt, and a symbol she had to draw on the floor. But as she moved to the basement, she could feel the air shifting, the house itself fighting against her. The growling voices now swarmed around her, the walls pressing inward, as though the house was alive, trying to swallow her whole. She had to move fast. Time was running out. As Lena knelt before the door, the entity's voice echoed through the walls, now a scream of rage. She had only one chance, one final attempt to seal the room before it tore its way into the world beyond.